Okay, one of the things I'm going to try to do. Okay, one of the things I'm going to try to do is record lectures for you. There we go. Record lectures for you. So hopefully every week I'll have a new recording. This is the first chapter. It's the introduction to psychology. We're just going to kind of hit everything, not get into depth with anything. We're going to cover chapter 1 and chapter 2. I hope. We'll see what happens. So, what is psychology? Psychology is a study of mental processes. That's what we're looking for. We don't do anything, even when we're dreaming. We're using our mental processes. As a science, psychology covers such topics as the nervous system, sensation and perception, learning and memory, intelligence, language, thought. One of the things you're going to notice about my lectures, I like pictures for one thing, and I try to make them a little funny. And of course, I don't know how funny that is, but anyway, thought, growth and development, personality, and you can see all the different personalities. This was when I first found this picture. It was about 10 years ago, and of course nobody had a beard back then. So this guy was quite unique. Now everybody's got a beard, so this guy would be weird anyway. And of course, there's a lady in Times Square, New York City. That's a lady with something on her mind. She just got married, and there we go. Okay. Stress and health, and yes, this is a picture of me doing push-ups in the mud after losing a mud volleyball game. This was up in Montana, and these are my good friends who who were on the other team and making me do push-ups. So, well, not making me do push-ups, but that was the bet. The bet was that the loser had to do push-ups. I still have that shirt, by the way. Not sure about the shorts. That's Manny and his wife, and that's his son, not son-in-law, brother-in-law. There we go. Psychological disorders, sexual behavior, social behavior, how do we act in society. People that were psych majors, Facebook creator Mark Zuckerberg was a psychology major. TV personality Jon Stewart was a psychology major. Actress Natalie Portman, who was actually born in Israel, but she moved to the United States when she was relatively young. She actually speaks Hebrew, but she graduated from Harvard, I think. Very, very bright lady. Amy Farrah Fowler of Big Bang Theory, Mayim Bialik, is actually a PhD in neuroscience. So she actually fit the criteria for being one of those very intelligent nerds on Big Bang Theory. Psychology started actually back in Greek times, ancient Greece. Uh, they considered it a philosophy. They debated how the mind actually worked. So they were the first people to even to write down what they were thinking about how the mind worked. It wasn't until the 19th century that physicians realized that certain illnesses were caused by maladjusted mental processes and could be improved through talking therapy. And that was, it didn't really start with Freud, but Freud was one of the first and foremost psychologists or doctors. Actually, he was a neurosurgeon. And most of the people that were dealing with psychology in 19th century Europe were doctors, were medical doctors. Alfred Adler, Carl Jung, they were all doctors. And of course, they are the ones that developed psychology. At the same time, scientists were investigating the process of thinking. So these were the doctors. The doctors were trying to clear the hospitals of individuals who were suffering from mental illness. And of course, they didn't call it mental illness at the time. They called it hysteria. They had different words for it. But as time went by, things got worse and worse and worse. And so that was, they started a whole field of psychology. One of the first individuals to deal with, one of the first scientists who wasn't a physician to deal with psychology was Wilhelm Wundt in Leipzig, Germany in 1873. That year he wrote The Principles of Physiological Psychology. It was a book that described his findings from experiments on human conscious processes. Wundt felt that he could identify components that combine to create conscious experience. He was trying to figure out. He was trying to codify. He was trying to create an understanding of how people think. Wundt built the first psychological laboratory and constructed experiments around mechanical stimuli, puffs of air, some sounds, reported through introspection, internal perception. In other words, what they would do, they would puff air into somebody's eye, and then they would think about what it felt like or what their response was, and then they would tell them. That's what introspection is. This direction and form of inquiry became known as structuralism and became dominant in Europe. So in Europe, we've got two movements going on. We've got Freud's psychoanalysis, his psychodynamic theory, his psychosexual theory, which we haven't really described yet. I'll talk about it in just a second. And then we've got Wundt, who's trying to figure out how the brain works. So he was dealing with a concept that he referred to as structuralism. In other words, he's trying to determine the building blocks that allowed us to think, and maybe where those building blocks got. Freud was trying to figure out how those building blocks became skewed or awry. But in the United States, of course, we weren't thinking of putting together building blocks. We're Americans, and we're always thinking of money and profit and getting people to work, and how do we get them to work more. And this is the direction that American academia took. The first individual with the most influence on American psychology was a scientist from Harvard University, William James. He thought that Wundt's way of looking at things, putting building blocks together, was too chopped up. He felt that humans thought in a fluid motion. It was fluid and continuous. So he developed a theory that was more functional than structural. And of course, that's what they call it. James' theory of functionalism sought to explain how we interact with our environment and how humans cope and develop habits, because it looked at the human mind as a mechanism of change and adaptation. His school of thought, of course, became labeled as the functionalist school. What was he trying to do? Was this industrial organizational psychology at its very beginning? Well, you could say that, because they were trying to determine how they could make people function better. So they weren't really looking for the esoteric idea of structuralism. They were looking for functionalism. And that's what his school became known as, the functionalist theory. Now, strangely enough, of course, Europeans and Americans, a lot of times, especially people on the East Coast, are enamored with what's happening in Europe, and they think of themselves as Western or Europeans. The reality, of course, is that they're Americans, and they have their own culture, and we have our own thought processes. We have our own way of putting things together, and this became a bone of contention between Europeans and American psychologists. So that we were pushing in two different directions. Uh, Europe was trying to determine how thought occurred, and in the United States, we were trying to make people more functional. While these schools of thought deal primarily with the philosophy and research of psychology, physicians were dealing with patients who were incapacitated by mental problems that were not physical in nature. They needed help to cure their patients in the form of counseling. The father of counseling psychology, of course, is Sigmund Freud, and that's Sigmund Freud to the left. That's him later in life. He was quite an attractive man. And one of the things that we will notice is that, one of the things I've noticed is that psychologists, if they are good looking, they tend to be good psychologists. That people want to do well for them, they want to get better for them. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that their clients find them attractive. The counseling technique developed by Freud was known as psychoanalysis, where he would allow the client to talk, just talk, and he wouldn't interrupt. One of the major problems during the 19th century was a diagnosis of hysteria, where the patient showed physical symptoms and emotional disturbances without any physical cause, and this was the basic problem. Now, normally when somebody comes in, a patient came in and they had a problem like depression or anxiety, there was a reason for it. Yes, you've got the French army is on your front door, and you're afraid they're going to invade. That's the reason for your anxiety. But sometimes people would just come up with problems, and there was no basic cause. And so Freud felt that these problems stemmed from problems in the patient's unconscious. They couldn't get over something in their minds. He felt that our experiences as an infant and child affected our behavior in the present. Freud hypothesized that the basic drive for humans was a sexual drive that began at birth and influenced the way infants and toddlers deal with the world. And he came up with this theory, and it was very controversial. For one thing, people didn't like to talk about sex, and for another thing, they didn't like to think of their little babies, their cute little infants, as even having a concept of sex. But of course, Freud was able to purport his theory and to get people to listen to him anyway. Freud felt that most of our unpleasant or socially improper ideas are repressed into our unconscious and can only escape through slips of the tongue and dreams. Because society tells us what we can and can't think of, and when we're talking about society, we're not just talking about mom and dad saying, stop playing with yourself, or stop saying, don't use that word, you don't know what it really means, washing your mouth out with soap. We're not really talking about them. We're talking about society, like religion telling you can't think about sex or talk about sex. And of course, that has that's really kind of fascinating. And I could talk to you all week on how religions attack and support this type of behavior, both at the same time. Freud felt that humans are controlled by these unwanted sexual thoughts, and that they are constantly repressing them. Of course, we have to repress them, otherwise we would want to have sex with everybody that we walk past in the street, and that is something that society won't allow you to even think about. And so the biggest problem that Freud saw was that as humans, we repress our sexuality. And one of the things that you need to think about, a lot of people attack Freud. As a matter of fact, we're going to talk about some of the attacks on Freud. But a lot of people attack Freud. But the reality is that he was dealing with the 19th century mind. And the reality may be that in the 19th century, the sexual repression was a very serious problem. And it caused a lot of individuals to have extended problems. We don't have the same repressed sexuality today that we had back then. Certainly, that was 150 years ago. And for that reason, looking back on what Freud said, we may think, oh no, he's wrong. He's totally wrong. I've never seen anything like that. Well, of course you haven't seen anything like that because we've had Freud's theory for the last 150 years telling us not to be sexually repressed. We think about, well, wait a minute, I need to think about my sexuality, otherwise I'm going to have I'm going to have mental problems. So for that reason, of course, it has skewed the way that we think and the way that we act. And you'll have to admit that if you look at things that were happening in the 1850s and 1870s and 1880s, then you'd have to admit that we are much, much less sexually repressed than we used to be. We have we have dating sites. We have well, anyway, we have a lot of dating sites, and the idea is that these people will get together, and maybe they'll just have sex, but probably they will try to find a relationship and get married. But I'm sure there's a number, at least a fairly large percentage of individuals who go onto those dating sites just looking for a sexual partner rather than a life partner. Anyway, repressed sexuality was very serious back in the 1880s, 1890s, and the turn of the 20th century. For a modern look at Freud, many psychologists have found fault with some of his earlier theories, and there's a reason for this. However, other psychologists point out that the basic premise behind his theories are sound and still widely accepted. His older theories are based on a European culture from 150 years ago, as I just said. Okay, so we're going to move past Freud. There were individuals that argued with Freud. As a matter of fact, he had a Wednesday night gathering of physicians and interested people in Vienna, where he practiced, and they would debate psychology. And these three individuals weren't three individuals that were members of the Wednesday night group. But there were people that argued with him. Jung argued with him, and Horney argued with him, as did Adler, was adamant that Freud didn't know what he was talking about. In the 1930s, three German psychologists fleeing Nazi Germany came to the United States and established the idea that the sum was greater than its parts, or Gestalt. That's the meaning of Gestalt. The making of the whole is greater than its smaller parts. Wertheimer, Kafka, and Köhler found structuralism as too limiting. They wanted to consider stimulus and response from the point of view of all the factors. And of course, if we look at all the factors, any time you respond to something, you're driving down the road and somebody turns in front of you, there are a lot of different things that have to do with you swerving and not hitting the other car. One is you paying attention. There may be music coming in. There may be somebody talking to you. There may be sunlight in your eyes. We've got all this different stimulation coming at you all at the same time, and you have to make a response. And the answer is, yeah, maybe you didn't have all the information, but you were able to swerve out of the way because there was enough information to put together to allow you to strike the other car. Gestaltists believe that perception is accomplished by integrating separate stimuli into meaningful patterns and taking these pieces to make a whole. A good example of this would be an optical illusion that people see as completed, though the pieces don't fit together completely. And of course, we may see this as a square, but the reality, this is all that we have. We only have pieces. We don't have any corners. The corners are all covered up, but your brain puts that together and creates a square underneath these four other squares on the corners. And of course, if we look at this, if you see a triangle here, then that is Gestalt, because all we see are three Pac-Men. If you see a dog in the woods sniffing at the ground, then the reality, it's just a series of spots, but you, of course, see what we have there. Okay, well, that's what was going on in Europe. At the same time, a Russian gastroenterologist around the turn of the century, 1904, I believe, was discovering that if he rang a bell, or if he tied the bell to feeding his dogs, that he could make the dogs salivate just by ringing the bell. And this he called classical conditioning. He discovered this because he was doing work on the stomachs of dogs. He was trying to determine what kind of digestive juices they were putting into their stomach. And one of the things he discovered was they didn't have to have food present for them to start salivating. And he realized that what was happening was that the dogs were hearing the door open. They knew it was that time of the day when they always get fed, and they started salivating because of that response. Well, one of the things he was able to do, he was able to tie the unconditioned response of the food and the salivation to it's an unconditioned stimulus. The food is an unconditioned stimulus, and he was able to tie that to a conditioned stimulus, and the conditioned stimulus in this case was a bell. And when he rang the bell, then he was able to get the dog to respond to just the bell ringing. There didn't have to be any food present. So he tied that idea, the idea of the bell, to food, and he could make them salivate. And one of the interesting things about classical conditioning is that if you don't support classical conditioning, in other words, if you don't ring the bell when you bring the food, eventually that they won't respond to it anymore. But if you do it one time, then they will have a spontaneous recovery, and of course we can we can see that, and we're going to talk about that later. I've got an interesting idea behind classical conditioning. A lot of times when you're in a relationship and the individual's not a very nice person and they're kind of abusive, so you leave them when they come back, and this has happened to me. When they come back, you forget all about the bad stuff and only remember the good stuff. And of course, that's another form of classical conditioning. So classical conditioning is an idea, and that idea was taken by John B. Watson of Johns Hopkins University, and he realized that we could use this classical conditioning to change people's behavior. He felt that psychology had no real way of dealing with what was going on in the mind. Everybody has different thoughts, so there's no way to control what's going on in the mind, but we can control their behavior, and we can observe their behavior. And for that reason, he referred to his ideas as behaviorism, and he was the first behaviorist, and he used Pavlov's classical conditioning to condition people to act the way he wanted them to act. That was his idea. Behaviorism dominated experimental psychology for several decades and influences research till this day. Behaviorism is responsible for establishing psychology as a scientific discipline with its objective methods and experimentation. Behavior modification continues to be used, especially in behavioral and cognitive behavioral therapy. So behaviorism is used to this day. Now, behaviorism began at the turn of the 20th century, just before World War I, and of course, it's still you can find people that still do behavioristic therapy. Behavior modification is what they refer to it as. Okay, so the behaviorists became a school. John B. Watson, actually, John B. Watson lost his job because he was messing around with somebody's wife. So he's lost his job, and by golly, so what did he do? He was hired by an advertising firm, and he's the one that changed our advertising to where we try to condition people to use their product. And he's the one that came up with that whole idea. But behaviorism wasn't dead just because he had sex with the wrong person. Um, this became a school of thought, and B.F. Skinner decided that he would adopt this behaviorism, but he was going to change it a little bit. Classical conditioning ties an unconditioned stimulus to an unconditioned response. And in the case of the dog, it was food and salivation. But he realized that well, hey, it didn't have to be something that is classical. It doesn't need to be a stimulus and response that they always respond to. He decided to tie unconditioned stimulus with unconditioned, with and create a response. So if it didn't happen in nature, it didn't make any difference to Skinner. Skinner was going to train uh, people and whatnot to do whatever he wanted them to do. And this he called operant conditioning. It's not classical conditioning, because classical conditioning is taking an unconditioned stimulus and an unconditioned response, and getting them to respond to something that has to be conditioned, the bell and the dog and the salivation. But of course, Skinner decided that he was going to tie stimulus to things that normally that the person or the animal didn't respond to. And this he called operant conditioning. Now, if you can train an elephant to play soccer or a raccoon to play basketball, that isn't normal behavior for a raccoon. In order to get a raccoon or an elephant to respond, you need to train them with something. You need to either reward or punish them for their behavior. And this he referred to as operant conditioning. Now, Skinner was kind of famous for creating a Skinner box. This is a Skinner box, where he would train a rat or a pigeon. Actually, Skinner trained pigeons to guide bombs. The first bomb-guided system. They put a pigeon in the nose of a bomb, and they dropped it. And if it was off target, the pigeon would hit a disc and force the bomb to fly in the right direction. They never used it, but he worked on pigeons and bombs through World War II. And of course, by the end of World War II, we had radio guided bombs that didn't work very well, but they worked better than his pigeons. Anyway, he created the Skinner box. It's a chamber that isolates the subject from the external environment and has a behavior indicator such as a lever or a button. In this case, the rat is pushing a button. If he pushes the button a certain number of times, he gets fed. And of course, that's what he's after, food. So he starts punching the thing a lot of different times. When the animal pushes a button or lever, the box is able to deliver a positive reinforcement, in this case, food, or punishment, such as a noise, or a token conditioner, such as a light, that is correlated with either the positive reinforcement or punishment. And for that reason, they were able to control the rat's behavior, or get the rat to do various things. Strangely enough, Skinner actually developed one of these Skinner boxes for humans. Um, it was a crib that you were supposed to be able to condition your child to behave the way you wanted them to behave. He actually used it on his daughter, and since Skinner died, she has complained about being used as a lab rat. Didn't like it. Didn't like growing up with daddy. During the early 20th century, American psychology was dominated by behaviorism and psychoanalysis. However, some psychologists were uncomfortable with what they viewed as limited perspectives being so influential to the field. They objected to the pessimism and the determinism. All actions were driven by the unconscious of Freud. They also disliked the reductionism, or the simplifying of nature, of behaviorism. Behaviorism is also deterministic at its core, because it sees human behavior as entirely determined by a combination of genetics and environment. Some psychologists began to form their own ideas that emphasize personal control and intentionality and a true predisposition for good as important for our self-concept and our behavior. Thus, humanism emerged. Humanism is a perspective within psychology that emphasizes the potential for good that is initiated to all humans. Two of the most well-known proponents of humanistic psychology are Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. Now, we talk about Maslow and Rogers specifically, but they were very influential in the humanistic movement. But there were a lot of psychologists that rebelled against Freud's ideas and against the behavioristic ideas. These are just two of the major ones. They weren't the first. There were a lot of individuals that thought Freud was full of bananas, that thought behaviorism was too strict. Freud saw humanity as bad. It needed to be changed to good. Behaviorism kind of sees the same thing, that we need to change your behavior because the behavior is bad. But humanists saw society as the evil one. Society creates the bad person, and what we need to do is bring out the good. And that's one of the reasons why it was referred to as humanism. A lot of this came out of the trenches of World War I. There was a lot of death and destruction, people just allowing themselves to be used by this military structure and dying en masse. And there were a lot of philosophical ideas that came out of World War I. One of them was existentialism, the idea that we exist within ourselves and that we need to focus on what allows us to exist. And that's, we talk about global warming as an existential problem. That's what we're talking about. This is something that if we do not take care of, we will not survive. We will not exist anymore. That's why they call it an existential problem. Abraham Maslow was an American psychologist best known for proposing a hierarchy of needs in motivating behavior. Maslow asserted that so long as basic needs necessary for survival were met, for example, food, water, and shelter, higher level needs, such as social needs, would begin to motivate behavior. According to Maslow, the highest level needs relate to self-actualization, a process by which we achieve our full potential. And of course, that's what we're looking for. But in order for us to achieve our full potential, first of all of our other needs have to be met. And of course, the physiological needs are the base. We need food, water, sleep. We need rest. We need to find a place to go to the bathroom. We need to breathe air. And sex is a physiological need. And he got that, of course, from Freud. Next, we need to feel safe. We need security of our body, our employment, our resources, our morality, the family, health, and property. People that go into social work, they use Maslow's hierarchy of needs all the time because basically when you're dealing with a family that is in crisis, the first thing you need to do is make sure they have food, water, and someplace to sleep. The next thing they need to be someplace that's safe. Once they're safe and once their physiological needs are met, then you can worry about their friendship, family, and the possibility of them responding sexually. The next level, of course, is self-esteem, confidence, achievement. This would be a job. And then the last thing you'd have to worry about was the self-actualization needs. So if you work in social work, this is one of the things you need to look at. You don't need to worry about their self-esteem or the fact that they are loved before you take care of all the safety and the physiological needs. Humanistic psychologists rejected the research approach because it missed the whole human being. This is Rogers down here, and this is Abraham Maslow. Maslow's story is very interesting. I'm not sure. I haven't really looked through this textbook. But we'll probably be talking about Maslow in the future, and his story is very interesting. Rogers, his story is kind of interesting as well, because Rogers decided that Freud was wrong. He started as a Freudian psychoanalyst, and he realized, wait a minute, we're missing something. I'm seeing this person as bad, and I need to make them good. But the reality is that it's society that makes this person bad. Really fascinating stuff. But we're going to get into that later. Beginning with Maslow and Rogers, there was an insistence on humanistic research program. This program has been largely qualitative, not measurement based, but there exists a number of quantitative research strains within humanistic psychology, including research on happiness, self concept, meditation, and the outcomes of humanistic psychotherapy. Now, this is really kind of fascinating because in 2001 they decided, uh, the American Psychological Association decided that they needed to change the direction of psychology or maybe skew it in a more positive direction. And this they referred to as positive psychology. And of course, I was part of that positive psychology movement, and I try to promote that to this day. This idea that we need to see positive things rather than negative things. So when I was started working on my PhD, I was working on an Indian reservation up in Montana. And I decided, instead of doing research on alcoholism or drug abuse or suicide or any of the other negative things that we always talk about when we talk about American Indians, that we needed to look at something positive. So I decided that I would do research on resilience. And that's what I did. I did my research on resilience. You can find it if you type resilience and Bruce Bradway into the into Google. You'll probably come up with my dissertation. But that was the idea. The idea was that why in the world focus on negative things that affects a small percentage of people? Why not focus on positive things that is more universal as far as the American Indians were concerned. That was my theory anyway. My results were very positive. I did find resilience on the reservation. Carl Rogers was also an American psychologist who emphasized the potential for good that exists within all people. Rogers used a therapeutic technique known as client centered therapy. Client centered therapy involves the patient taking a lead role in the therapy session, just like with Freud. Rogers believed that a therapist needed to display three features to maximize the effectiveness of his particular approach: unconditional positive regard, genuineness, and empathy. And if I can do this right, this is him.
I am very fortunate, and the client is very fortunate, if I can feel I really accept you fully just as you are. Uh, Sometimes that's very difficult. I held an interview with a young man in South Africa. I didn't know anything about him. It turned out he was an officer in the South African Army. Now, for me, that meant it meant that I stretched my empathic abilities to their very limit to try to be with him, to try to understand him, to try to be caring toward him. I didn't feel I did too well. And yet, I've learned since that interview really changed the course of his life. So I feel that if I can be genuinely understanding, try to listen not only to the words but to the meaning, trying to understand the person that's hidden within each one of us, that's helpful. If I really care about this person in an unconditional way, that's helpful. If I can really be myself in the relationship, not a professional expert, not a, quote, psychologist, not a psychotherapist, just me in that relationship, that's helpful. All those things are possible, and when they come together, that creates a very powerful climate change, for growth, for drawing out the potential of the client.
There we go. Okay, that was Carl Rogers. He's no longer with us, of course. He died about 3 decades ago, back in the 90s. There we go. Okay. Unconditional positive regard, and this is what this is one of the things that Rogers was talking about. Refers to the fact that the therapist accepts their client for who they are, no matter what he or she might say. Provided these factors, Rogers believed that people were more than capable of dealing with and working through their own issues. Rogers' client-centered approach to therapy is still commonly used in psychotherapeutic settings today. As a matter of fact, I started in psychology in 1975, and I was trained as a client-centered therapist at the University of Northern Colorado. Actually, I wasn't in Northern Colorado. I was in Texas, but it was an extension course, and that's how I was trained as a client-centered therapist. Of course, back then we called it patient-centered therapy, not client-centered therapy. And it's not even called client-centered therapy anymore. It's called person-centered therapy. So we try to change the patient is too pedantic. Patient is too negative, and so is client in this case. So they changed it to person-centered therapy. I'm surprised it's not in this book. From the first 2 chapters, I'd say this book was written by cognitive psychologists. They seem a bit more cognitive than anything else. Throughout the 40s and 50s, psychology was being pulled in 2 completely opposite directions: the strict empirical objectivity of dehumanization of behaviorism and the humanistic focus on feelings and the individual. In the 1950s and 1960s, a new melding of the 2 schools began with the cognitive revolution. The cognitive focus was to explain the individual mental process by use of the science available, especially through the new field of computers. This is really kind of interesting, because when this first started, and of course I was around when this first started, the first cognitive psychology text was written in 1967. That was the year I graduated from high school. So I was in on the beginning of this whole cognitive revolution. It's really kind of fascinating, because they started talking about brains as if they were computers. Well, back then, in the 50s and 60s, computers looked like desks. They were huge. They didn't have any desktop computers. There were no laptop computers. You certainly didn't have iPads and whatnot. Computers were massive. Anyway, they were trying to figure out how the brain worked, and they these individuals kept comparing the brain to computers, which is just fascinating, because now we're trying to create computers that are like the human brain. That's artificial intelligence. The new field not only compared the human brain to the organization necessary in computer science, but linguistics, anthropology, and neuroscience as well. If you talk to a cognitive psychologist today, they won't even mention computers. But once upon a time, that was their main focus, was how similar the human brain is to computers. European psychology had never really been as influenced by behaviorism as had American psychology, and thus the cognitive revolution helped reestablish lines of communication between the European psychologists and their American counterparts. The influence and prominence of this particular perspective resonates in modern day psychology. I won't argue with that, but okay. Well, anyway, culture has important impacts on individuals in social psychology, yet the effects of culture on psychology are understudied. There is a risk that psychological theories and data derived from white American settings could be assumed to apply to individuals and social groups from other cultures, and this is unlikely to be true. One weakness in cross-cultural psychology is that in looking for differences in psychological attributes across cultures, there remains a need to go beyond simple statistics. In 1920, Francis Cecil Sumner was the first African American to receive a PhD in psychology in the United States. Much of the work of early psychologists from diverse backgrounds was dedicated to challenging intelligence testing and promoting innovative educational methods for children. And of course, that was Sumner's focus. In 1894, Margaret Floyd Washburn was the first woman awarded the doctoral degree in psychology, and this is Margaret Floyd Washburn. I don't have my arrow. Anyway, the lady on top is Margaret Floyd Washburn. She's not in her PhD robes. That's just a hat. Washburn worked in comparative psychology, comparing structuralism, functionalism, behaviorism. She was comparing all the comparative. She was looking at people from different cultures, people from different perspectives, and that's what comparative psychology deals with. In the mid 1890s, Mary Whitten Calkins completed all requirements toward the PhD in psychology, but Harvard University refused to award her the degree because she was a woman. In the 1890s, actually until the 1970s, Harvard was all male. Vassar was its sister school for women, and of course, that Vassar didn't have a graduate program in psychology, so there was Mary Whitten Calkins. She eventually did get her PhD. Calkins did memory research. That's the research she was looking at. That's the field that she went into. Inez Beverly Prosser was the first black woman to receive her PhD in psychology in 1933 from the University of Cincinnati. Now, one of the interesting things about Cincinnati is that it's on the border with Kentucky and Cincinnati, but it tends to be a little bit more liberal. And for that reason, of course, whereas other individuals it was difficult for them to get a degree to even go to school if they were African American. Cincinnati, of course, is a little bit more liberal. The research by Prosser, along with Francis Sumner, was instrumental in the court case of Brown versus the Board of Education. This was the case that integrated American schools. This was in 1955, 56. It was her research that assisted the case, her research, and that of Francis Sumner, and so she was instrumental in helping integrate schools. Now, this was in the 50s. Of course, they had to pass laws, and in the 60s, they passed the Civil Rights Law. In the 70s, they pushed busing so that people would be in integrated schools. So this was a process. The whole integration of schools was a process. The study of brain and nervous system has enjoyed increased popularity over the past several decades through the development of the various brain imaging machines. Initially, the only way of mapping the activity of the brain was through the EEG, or the electroencephalogram. This is what an EEG looks like, the thing on the top. X-rays are not really sensitive enough to show a good picture of the inner workings of the brain. All it did was show the structure of the brain. But with succeeding generations of brain imaging machines, a working view of the brain and its structures has become possible. Of course, autopsy, after you're dead, autopsies, it really doesn't matter what's going on in your brain. It's not a thinking entity anymore anyway. The next generation of brain imaging instruments was the CAT scan, the computerized axial tomography scan. The CAT scan is an X-ray of a thin sliver of body tissue, and this is what a CAT scan looks like. They're trying to find anomalies in thin slivers. The next generation of brain imaging instruments was MRI, the magnetic resonance imaging. MRIs use a series of magnetic fields to detect the chemical activity in the brain, and of course, this is what it looks like. You can actually see the structure of the brain in an MRI. The latest brain imaging instrument is the PET scan, the positron emission tomography. This brain imaging instrument detects radioactive glucose that has previously been injected into the individual's brain. And it shows it being used, actually. And it shows it as dark red spots. Wait a second. let me do this, and I can get my arrow back. There we go. I got my arrow back. Okay. Anyway, where it's red is where the activity is taking place. This is the radioactive glucose being utilized, and of course, it turns out is red. There's a functional MRI that does the same thing. It's a little bit cheaper. Anyway, evolutionary psychologists attempt to determine perpetual mental attributes that are true and will potentially continue to be true no matter which culture you were looking at over time. Since attributes as aggression and mating patterns may have perpetual patterns that are carried through succeeding generations and will continue in the future. Such attributes. Okay, anyway, I guess I didn't say that quite right. Anyway, evolutionary psychology follows the precepts of Charles Darwin that there is a basic structure to survival. It is that the most capable attributes of a species will assist the species in surviving and reproducing. Those aspects that do not will not be repeated. That's the idea. Some things continue to exist, like the marmot, and some things don't, because they are counterproductive for the species. And of course, if you've ever seen a cardinal flying across the fields, you can spot them right away. You may not be able to see a blackbird or a sparrow, but spatially male cardinals are very bright. You can see them from a mile away because they are bright red, and nothing else in nature is bright red. Why the peacock has such a magnificent tail? It really hinders them in their movement. The peacock was actually protected in China, and that's why it was able to continue to exist. This is what a peahen looks like. You can see she's a little bit more functional, and you can see that the female cardinal is more camouflaged than the male cardinal. If you're going after your next meal, it's easy to find your red target or your long-tailed friend. Cognitive psychology, cognitive perspective of psychology is very popular in the United States, especially right now. Cognitive psychology primarily looks at mental processes to understand behavior, the thinking, memory, language, problem solving, creativity. Cognitivists concentrate more on mental processes than on behavioral processes. For this reason, and this is really kind of fascinating, I've worked with a number of different cognitive psychologists. One of them didn't believe in mental illness because he said they were just confused, and that's why they were mentally ill. So I offered to lend him my DSM-5. It was right after the DSM-5 came out. And he said that he would never borrow the DSM-5 because he didn't believe a word of it, which was kind of curious. Now, I'm not saying that all cognitive psychologists don't believe in mental illness, but this one certainly didn't. Developmental psychology is the scientific study of development across a lifespan. Developmental psychologists are interested in processes related to physical maturation. They are focused on physical changes as well as changes in cognitive skills, moral reasoning, social behavior, and other psychological attributes. Early developmental psychologists focused primarily on changes that occurred through reaching adulthood, providing enormous insight into the difference in physical, cognitive, and social capacities that exist between very young and young children and adults. And this is one of the things that Freud did. He had a developmental theory, and he called it his psychosexual theory, and that was really kind of fascinating. There were three major developmental theories. The first one was Freud's psychosexual theory. So he talked about children when they were first born. They had the focus. They focused on their mouth. Later on, because they needed to be potty trained, they focused on their anus. All of these became focal points for them. So Freud, his theory was based on sexual maturation. Next came Erickson. Erickson focused on the social aspect of development, how the various crises took place and needed to be taken care of. And he called his the psychosocial developmental theory. Then came along Piaget. Piaget, he wanted to focus on the cognitive development, the mental acuity of children and toddlers and whatnot. And for this reason, he called his the cognitive developmental theory. And it's really kind of fascinating. When I first started in teaching psychology, the focus was on Erickson. And the reason was because that was the newest theory. People didn't like to think of kids as being sexual. So Erickson was the de rigueur theory that education focused on, and then and this was in the 1970s. You never heard the name Piaget, and the reason you never heard the name Piaget was because he was Swiss. He was from Switzerland, and he wrote in French. And at the time, the United States was kind of upset with the French for various reasons. There are still people that swear that there's something wrong with the French. But for that reason, we weren't translating things from French to English. So we ignored him until the what was it, 1990s. All of a sudden, Piaget became the theory to read. And it wasn't new because he wrote all this stuff at the turn of the 20th century into the 1930s, 1940s. Came to the United States in 1950, 1960. You can see film of him as an old man in the United States, and this is him as an old man, of course. But he had written his theory a long, long before that. Anyway, now if you are looking for educational theories of development, they don't mention Erickson anymore. They certainly don't mention Freud, but they do mention Piaget. So Piaget is the educational developmental theory that educators are looking at. Object permanence refers to the understanding that physical things continue to exist even if they are hidden from us. If you were to show an adult a toy and then hide it behind a curtain, the adult knows that the toy still exists. You can see this child has opened up this toy to get the worm out of the apple. That's the worm right there. This is really kind of interesting. And if you have a toy like this where something is hidden and the child finds that hidden thing, they will take it out and they'll leave it out. And the reason they do that is because if it's inside they don't have object permanence at this point. So if it's inside the toy, then it doesn't exist. So what they'll do is they'll open it up and they'll leave it open, or they will take the toy out. They won't allow it to be hidden anymore, as curious as that is. Personality psychology. So if you want to study educational psychology right now, Piaget, you'll probably talk about Erickson a little bit. You won't talk about Freud at all. You won't talk about Freud unless you're talking about disorders, mental disorders. Then you may talk about Freud. But Piaget is the name in educational psychology right now. Personality psychology focuses on patterns of thoughts and behaviors that make each individual unique. The American psychologist Gordon Allport contributed to early theories of personality. That's Gordon Allport on the right. These early theorists, that's Gordon Allport, I've got my arrow back. These early theorists attempted to explain how an individual's personality develops from his or her given perspective. Freud proposed that personality arose as conflicts between the conscious and the unconscious parts of the mind were carried out over the lifespan. Specifically, Freud theorized that an individual went through various psychosexual stages of development, as I was saying before. And we'll talk about this later. Adult personality would result from the resolution of various conflicts that centered on the migration of erogenous or sexually pleasure-producing zones from the oral, the mouth to the anus, to the phallus, to the genitals. Like many of Freud's theories, this particular idea was controversial and did not lend itself to experimental tests. This was the problem. This is the reason that people argue about Freud. This is all a mental process, but we can't measure it. There's no way to quantify it. And since we've got behaviorism and we've got functionalism and we've got structuralism out there, and now we have cognitive psychology, there's no way to measure these ideas. We can't prove that they're true. And for that reason, people attack Freud. Rather than explaining how personality arises, current research is focused on identifying personality traits, measuring them, and determining how they interact in particular contexts. What are we looking for? We're trying to cure problems. We're trying to take care of problems. So when do we talk about Freud? We talk about Freud if we have somebody that is a rapist, somebody with sexual fetishes, somebody who becomes non-functional because of their sexual ideas. Okay, and that's the reason these things are taking place. This is the reason we're studying these things. Personality traits are relatively consistent. So if we're talking about somebody that is there's a problem with them, that's what old psychology did before 2000, before we had positive psychology. We were just focusing on the fixing people who had a problem, who couldn't get along in society. But now, of course, we focus on different things, and it's difficult for us to identify what broken means. Why is this inappropriate? Can they hold down a job? All of these things are really important. So Freud was focusing on, I need to fix these people to make them functional members of society. And that's when he came up with this theory, because sexual repression was very common 150 years ago. And now, of course, sexual repression isn't the problem, so Freud looks like he was wrong. Well, he wasn't wrong. He was right for his time, and now it's a different time. But if we find somebody with a odd sexual proclivity, we look to Freud for answers. And having worked in this field, having worked with people that have been arrested for sexual crimes, I can tell you that we don't really talk about Erickson, we don't talk about Piaget, we talk about Freud. We try to figure out when his idea of sexuality or her idea of sexuality became skewed. When in their childhood, and what caused it. And if we can do that, then a lot of times we can help them. Personality traits, but now of course we need to figure out why people are normal. What is a good personality? How can we fix this person with a personality disorder? Personality traits are relatively consistent patterns of thought and behavior, and many have proposed that 5 trait dimensions are sufficient to capture the variations in personality seen across individuals. Now, this is really kind of interesting. The 5 traits that they're talking about have to do with conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, openness, and extroversion. These are the big 5. This is the 5-factor model. But the interesting thing is, this is true in the United States, it's true in Europe, but it's not true in other countries. Brazil has their own personality traits that are different from the United States. The Philippines has their own personality traits. India has their own personality traits. Different cultures will have their own personality traits. And you can't use these. Well, you can use them. Usually it's an addition to the big 5. Each of these traits has been demonstrated to be relatively stable over the lifespan and is influenced by genetics. Now, the curious thing about the big 5 was developed in the 1950s by researchers at the RAND Corporation. I think we're probably going to talk about this later, but by researchers at the RAND Corporation, they were trying to determine, they had a new field, a new military organization, the Air Force, And they realized, well, officers in the Army and officers in the Air Force have to have different personalities because one is we need to make sure that the pilots are, they're flying jets that if they make a mistake or they start daydreaming, they're going to crash and then they're going to kill lots of people potentially. So they realized that officers in the Army and officers in the Air Force had to be a little bit different. So they were looking for personality traits. They wanted to get rid of the people that were hot dogs, all of these things that wouldn't follow the rules. They needed to get rid of them, and so they used the big five. They came up with the five personality traits that needed to be looked at to find a good Air Force officer as compared to a good Army officer or naval officer or whatnot. So that's where the big five came from. Social psychology promotes studying populations by their cultural beliefs. We'll talk more about the big five later. Attitudes and values rather than trying to establish similarities between groups. These scientists seek to discover how different cultural norms affect behavior and mental processes. While most psychological perspectives try to amalgamate people, throwing them into general categories, social psychologists articulate the differences between people. Social psychology allows scientists to demonstrate how select cultural proclivities influence social, political, or economic factors on behavior and development. Only by recognizing regional and ethnic differences can demographers target specific areas to identify specific social problems in areas such as low test scores, high drug usage, or frequent suicide. We thought that the world was completely bifurcated back in the 1950s and 1960s. We thought that black people acted this way, and they always live in these kinds of conditions. That they have low test scores because of a problem that they have. We did the same thing with Asians. We did the same thing with any minority in the United States. And then the social psychologists started saying, "Hey, look, if we take somebody out of this environment and put them in this social environment, then they turn out differently." And of course, this is what we continue to try to do. We try to find out what factors are creating the negative situations. In the 1960s, Nazi war criminals were being caught and executed. They all used the defense that they were only following orders when they executed approximately 6 million Jews and millions of others. And of course, the millions of others had to do with homosexuals. They called them sexual deviants. They were executing evangelicals. They were executing the Romani, which were commonly called the Gypsies. They were finding these people. They were putting them on trains, and then they're taking them to execution camps. Stanley Milgram wanted to know if this was true. If the Nazis who were executing all these millions of people really knew what was going on. Why did they do it? Milgram brought in two subjects. One was to induce better memory, and the other by shocking the other. So he brought these two people in, and one of them was going to be the subject, and the other one was going to be the teacher. And the teacher was supposed to give a question to the learner, and if the learner got it wrong, then he was supposed to electrocute them. I'm sorry, he was supposed to shock them with a low voltage shock, but he increased the voltage every time they got an answer wrong. The voltage went from a tingly 45 volts to a near deadly 450 volts. Unfortunately, electricity reduces memory instead of improves it, and all subjects had to be taken up to the 450 volts. No matter how much the subject screamed, cried, and pleaded, the doctor-researcher instructed the subject to shock them. And as you can see from this picture, here is the researcher, and this is the individual doing the shocking, and there is the subject right there. And of course, this is the subject. This is one of the other subjects. This is a doctor, and this is a subject attaching the electrodes to this individual. This is the learner, of course, and he's supposed to be learning. There you go. This is the shocker, and here he is. He's attaching the electrodes to the guy's hands and wrists. Okay. While the subject being shocked was an actor who wasn't really being shocked, the subjects didn't know that. Of the 40 men in Milgram's initial experiment, 93% agreed to the experiment, and 65% shocked the victim up to 450 volts, despite the screams. And he was screaming. Remember, he was an actor. They were only kidding. Sorry. That's a line from the movie Roxanne, if you've ever seen it. It's a funny movie. Anyway, the Milgram experiment was really an experiment about obedience. And when it was repeated with other subject configurations and around the world, the percentage of people willing to shock the victim to the max was between 61% and 67%. So here we go. He's shocking somebody. Variations, they looked at adult women. They thought, well, men are mean SOBs, but women are fine. Women wouldn't do that. No, women did the same thing, 65%. In 1966, Hofling and his colleagues did an experiment. They telephoned nurses. They acted as if they were a doctor that the nurse didn't know. The nurses were ordered to administer a non-prescribed drug and double the maximum dosage to a patient. 22 nurses were called. 21 of the nurses, 95.5% of the nurses, were willing to give their patient a lethal dosage, even though they knew it was a lethal dosage. They were obedient. So women are obedient just like men are obedient. Okay, and that was the whole point of Milgram's experiment. So no matter where it was, obedience became very prevalent, in 2/3 of the people. And of course, it didn't make any difference as far as the women were concerned. They had exactly the same level of obedience as everyone else. And then, of course, you have this other experiment that looked at the obedience of female nurses, and they found that, yep, they do whatever the doctor tells them, even if they know it's wrong. Industrial organizational psychology conducts research to improve. We're going to talk more about the Milgram experiment. It's really kind of a fascinating piece of research. Industrial organizational psychology conducts research to improve the workplace environment for both employees and managers. They work as consultants to design programs to improve morale, increase job satisfaction, foster better communication, enhance productivity, increase worker involvement in decision making. And that's industrial organizational psychology. We do not have an IO psychology class at this institution, but we do have a health psychology class. With the advance of medicine, psychologists began to realize that human emotions, such as stress and depression, could alter the physical health of the individual, causing ulcers, skin diseases, stomach disorders, infectious diseases, and even cancers. This has been the fear of the COVID-19 pandemic, was the fact that with people being isolated, they become depressed, and if they became depressed, they became more susceptible to COVID-19. Health psychology teaches techniques to control these emotions in order to promote good health. One of the things we're not sure about, as far as the pandemic is concerned, is whether individuals who have been vaccinated and have come down with the disease, what are the factors of these individuals? Are they depressed? Do they have high anxiety levels? Is there a racial or ethnic group that is more susceptible to infection after vaccination? Does it have to do with blood type? This is something we've discovered over the last year and a half, is that people with type A blood are more susceptible to a more serious COVID-19 response. And the reason is because they have a overactive immune system that creates a situation when they're trying to fight the disease that is more dangerous actually than than the disease itself. Researchers in sports and exercise psychology study the psychological aspects of sport performance, including motivation and performance anxiety, and the effects of sport on mental and emotional well-being. Research is also conducted on similar topics as they relate to physical exercise in general, such as mental and physical performance under demanding conditions, like firefighting, military operations, artistic performance, and surgery. Sport exercise psychology, I taught this when I was working at Ashford University. I taught sports psychology. I was a college athlete, so I've competed at a fairly high athletic level, but I was a college athlete in the 1960s and 1970s, a long time ago. Clinical psychology is the area of psychology that focuses on the diagnosis and treatment of psychological disorders and other problematic patterns of behavior. As such, it is generally considered to be a more applied area within psychology. Counseling psychology is a similar discipline that focuses on emotional, social, vocational, and health-related outcomes in individuals who are considered psychologically healthy. While aspects of Freud's psychoanalytic theory are still found among some of today's therapists, Rogers' ideas about client-centered therapy have been especially influential in shaping how many clinicians operate. The reality is, even though that we study as cognitive psychologists or client-centered therapists or cognitive behavioral therapists, it doesn't really matter. We tend to be eclectic. We tend to counsel if we need to use a little bit of Freud to take care of this individual, we'll do it. If we need client-centered therapy, we'll use that. There are very few psychologists that are strictly one thing or another. Both behaviorism and the cognitive revolution have shaped clinical practice in the forms of behavioral therapy, cognitive therapy, and cognitive behavioral therapy. This is the area of psychology that receives the most attention in popular media, and many people mistakenly assume that all psychology is clinical psychology. And I thought I had a picture. There it is. Okay. Wait a minute. There we go. Clinical psychology, as you can see, 37% of all psychologists are clinical psychologists, and almost half work in counseling or in a clinical setting. That's educational psychology, that's school psychology, where's teaching? Well, I don't see it here. Okay, well, anyway, there you go. Where do they work? They work in universities, colleges, and post-secondary schools, 37%. And as you can see, okay. Anyway, where am I? I'm here. Forensic psychology is a branch of psychology that deals with questions of psychology as they arise in the context of the justice system. Forensic psychologists will assess a person's competency to stand trial, assess the state of mind of a defendant, act as a consultant on child custody cases, consult on sentencing and treatment recommendations, and advise on issues such as eyewitness testimony and children's testimony. This is where you find psychologists. 37% are in university, colleges, and post-secondary schools, so most of them work in education. 28% are in hospitals and clinics, businesses, 6%, government, military, criminal justice system, 8%. 6% are in primary and secondary schools and school districts. This is the school psychologist. And 15% are in some other area, and we already looked at that. Psychologists can work in many different places, as places doing many different things. In general, anyone wishing to continue a career in psychology at a four-year institution of higher education will have to earn a doctoral degree in psychology for some specialties and at least a master's degree for others. In most areas of psychology, this means earning a PhD in a relevant area of psychology. Literally, PhD refers to a Doctor of Philosophy degree, But philosophy in this context refers to the ability to philosophize in the discipline of psychology. So I have a PhD in psychology. That means I can expound or philosophize about psychology, which I seem to be doing right now. Since the 1970s, individuals who wish to become practicing clinical psychologists have had another option for earning a doctoral degree. It's called a Psych D, Doctor of Psychology. Psych D is a Doctor of Psychology degree that is increasingly popular. Psych D programs generally place less emphasis on research-oriented skills and focus more on application of psychological principles in the clinical context. As a matter of fact, who do we have? I think Professor Barber is working on a Psych D from a school in Southern California. And that is the end of that chapter. We're going to tackle chapter 2 as well. I'll see if I can get through this. My grandson has a soccer game, so I need to be out. I've only got an hour to cover this, so let's see if I can do it. Scientific research is a critical tool for success. This is about psychological research. Scientific research is a critical tool for successfully navigating our complex world. Without it, we would be forced to rely solely on intuition, other people's authority, and blind luck. While many of us feel confident in our abilities to decipher and interact with the world around us, history is filled with examples of how very wrong we can be when we fail to recognize the need for evidence in supporting claims. At various times in history, we would have been certain that the sun revolved around a flat earth, that the Earth's continents did not move, and that mental illness was caused by possession. Now, the Earth's continents, this is really kind of interesting because I had a friend who was a geologist, and he studied geology in the 60s and 70s. And they hadn't come up with plate theory at that point. And so he got his bachelor's degree in geology, and lo and behold, when he started trying to find a job in the field, they had come up with a new theory, and that new theory was I can't find it anyway. That new theory had to do with plate theory, and since he had never studied plate theory, he couldn't find a job because the new understanding of geology had to do with plate theory, and he didn't have any of that information at all. Because when he had studied geology, they didn't talk. There was no plate theory, so that was something brand new that happened. I'm looking for something, and I can't find it. If you saw my desk, you would know how messy I am. Sadly. Okay. Well, anyway. It is through systematic scientific research that we divest ourselves of our preconceived notions and superstitions and gain an objective understanding of ourselves and our world. There are a lot of people that belong to the Flat Earth Society. It's just ignorant. I've been up in an airplane and I've seen the curve of the Earth. I know the Earth curves; it's not flat. We watch the sun come up and set every day. That's just something. People need to be thinkers. They need to be critical thinkers. They need to analyze everything. Just because a piece of information comes from somebody you like former President Trump, doesn't mean that what he says is true. Everything that we see, everything that we listen to, we need to be critical about. We need to determine whether that is right or wrong. Not just for ourselves, but for everybody. Does this make any sense? Where in the world did this come from? I'm not just talking about politicians. I'm talking about everything. I don't know how you feel about global warming, but there are a lot of people that don't believe it, that global warming is a problem or that it exists. They think it's something that scientists came up with. I still can't find that thing. All right. Okay. Scientific knowledge is advanced through a process known as the scientific method. Basically, ideas in the form of theories and hypotheses are tested against the real world in the form of empirical observations, and those empirical observations lead to more ideas that are tested against the real world, and so on. In this sense, the scientific process is circular. Now, this is really kind of interesting because the pandemic created a crisis between and politics and science, and for that reason, there was a lot of argument going on. We're having a problem getting select individuals to become vaccinated, mainly because they don't believe that they think that the pandemic is a hoax. They didn't see 590,000 dead bodies, so they don't know that those people died. They think people lied to them. As strange and interesting as that is, all right, I'm not gonna. Yes, I am. I'm going to stress over it. Anyway, so we've had this argument about vaccination, and now there are select groups of individuals who don't want to be vaccinated. I know the reservation's doing a fantastic job of getting people vaccinated, but we need everybody to get vaccinated, and that includes you, no matter what your religion is, and you, no matter what your politics are. But we have Republicans that are refusing to get vaccinated. We have evangelical Christians that are refusing to be vaccinated. And it's because they don't believe the science. They believed what they were told by President Trump. They believed what was coming out of the Trump administration. And it wasn't all that positive. So why in the world would Trump say these things? Well, one of the reasons he said these things is because if we support science, as far as the pandemic is concerned, then we kind of have to support the concept of global warming. And if we do that, then we're going to have to do something about it. And if we do something about it, it's going to cost us money. And if it costs us money, by golly, I can't make as much because I have to pay so much money to take care of global warming. It's going to cost me money. And of course, businessmen don't want to do that. So that's where the science comes in. And that's one of the reasons why they're arguing about it. The types of reasoning within the circle are called deductive and inductive. This is the circle we were taught, the scientific method. So there are two types of reasoning that we use, inductive and deductive reasoning. In deductive reasoning, ideas are tested in the real world. In inductive reasoning, real-world observations lead to new ideas. In the scientific context, deductive reasoning begins with a generalization. Global warming, and we have this general hypothesis that is then used to reach logical conclusions about the real world. So in deductive reasoning, we start out with a generalized information, and we develop a theory. If the hypothesis is correct, then the logical conclusions reached through deductive reasoning should also be correct. So we go from general to specific as far as deductive reasoning is concerned. Inductive reasoning uses empirical observations to construct broad generalizations. Conclusions drawn from inductive reasoning may or may not be correct, regardless of the observations on which they are based. Scientists use inductive reasoning to formulate theories, which in turn generates hypotheses that are tested with deductive reasoning. So inductive reasoning starts with a specific idea, and then they generalize it. A theory is a well-developed, so deductive reasoning is general idea to a specific idea. Inductive reasoning is a specific idea to a general idea. A theory is a well-developed set of ideas that propose an explanation for observed phenomena. Theories are repeatedly checked against the world, but they tend to be too complex to be tested all at once. Instead, researchers create hypotheses to test specific aspects of a theory. A hypothesis is a testable prediction about how the world will behave if our idea is correct, and it is often worded as if-then statements. For example, if I study all night, I will get a passing grade on the test. The hypothesis is extremely important because it bridges the gap between the realm of ideas and the real world. As specific hypotheses are tested, theories are modified, hi Reese, and refined to reflect and incorporate the result of these tests. Okay, so we're going to talk about a theory and what happens. You've heard the old wives' tale, are women really attracted to men who have an edge and reject the nice guys? And of course, if we watch movies from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and 2010s, if we watch The Big Bang Theory, we see that the pretty lady was attracted to dominant men, and the nice guys, the nerds, were rejected by her because they weren't something. A study by a group from Texas A&M University used 3 interlocking studies to discover whether women found dominance attractive. The theory was that women are attracted to dominant men, and I'm guessing that this guy is cooler than this guy is. So this would be the individual that would be dominant, and this is the nerd that the women would reject. Results from the 3 studies showed that women were more attracted to men who were altruistic than ones who were dominant. However, women found men who were more dominant as more sexual and more physically attractive than men who were not dominant. Do nice guys really finish last? Evidently, while women find dominant men more attractive, it is nice guys they would rather be around. In other words, if this guy is a jerk, but he's dominant and he's better looking, they'd rather be around this guy because this guy's a nice guy and he's more altruistic. So they'd rather be around him, but they're more sexually attracted to this guy. All right. Research from 1988 by David Buss indicates that women respond more readily to men who are more dominant and display their attributes more readily. So which is more accurate, the research from 1988 in Michigan or the research from 1995 in Texas? And the answer is, there is no answer. This is what one piece of research said, that they are more likely to be around with a nice guy, more altruistic person than a dominant guy. And from Michigan, David Buss found that dominant men who display their dominance are more likely to attract women. A scientific hypothesis is also falsifiable or capable of being shown to be incorrect. Sigmund Freud had lots of interesting ideas to explain various human behaviors. However, a major criticism of Freud's theories is that many of his ideas are not falsifiable. Despite this, Freud's theories are widely taught in introductory psychology texts because of their historical significance for personality psychology and psychotherapy, and these remain the root of all modern forms of therapy. As a matter of fact, when they started developing other forms of therapy, it was Freud that they were arguing with. They were saying, yeah, Freud, he can help people, he can fix people, but Freud is wrong in this aspect. That's where Rogers came up with his theory. He said, yeah, Freud sees people as bad and need to be fixed to make them good, but the reality is that people are actually good, and it's society that makes them bad. So he was arguing with Freud. So all of the theories after Freud argued with Freud. And because of that, because everybody needs to argue with Freud, that's why we teach you about Freud's theories. There are many research methods available to psychologists in their efforts to understand, describe, and explain behavior and the cognitive and biological processes that underlie it. Some methods rely on observational techniques. Other approaches involve interactions between the researcher and the individuals who are being studied, ranging from a series of simple questions to extensive in-depth interviews to well-controlled experiments. Each of these research methods has unique strengths and weaknesses, and each method may only be appropriate for certain types of research questions. Correlational research can find a relationship between 2 variables, but the only way a researcher can claim that the relationship between the variables is cause and effect is to perform an experiment. In experimental research, there is a tremendous amount of control over variables of interest. While this is a powerful approach, experiments are often conducted in very artificial settings. This calls into question the validity of experimental findings and how they would apply in real world settings. Okay, let me take a quick drink. Sorry. In observational research, scientists are conducting a clinical or case study when they focus on one person or just a few individuals. When they focus their attention on a very small number of people, they can gain a tremendous amount of insight into those cases. If scientists ultimately want to explain all behavior, focusing attention on such a special group of people can make it difficult to generalize any observations to the larger population as a whole. This is Genie, spelled Genie. They found this little girl when she was about, this is when they first found her, actually. They put clothes on her. She was living with coyote wolves, actually. She was a feral child. She was wild. And they tried to teach her how to be a human. Now, since she was so old, it was very difficult to teach her anything. This was a case study. There aren't that many feral children out there, or there haven't been that many feral children. And one of the things we discovered from dealing with Jeannie, this is a case study of this select individual. One of the things we discovered was it was almost impossible to teach her fluid language. She did learn specific words, but she didn't learn to speak in a fluid manner. Her behavior it was difficult to change her behavior as well. As you can see, here she is walking as like she walked when she was with the wolves. There was another case in Russia, very similar, and this individual would actually run on all fours rather than upright like a human. Generalizing refers to the ability to apply the findings of a particular research project to larger segments of society. Case studies provide enormous amounts of information, but since the cases are so specific, the potential to apply what's learned to the average person may be very limited. And of course, that is always a problem. One of the best ways to gain information is to simply observe the behavior in its natural context. However, people might change their behavior in unexpected ways if they know that they are being observed. It is critical that the observer be as unobtrusive and as inconspicuous as possible. When people know that they're being watched, they are less likely to behave naturally, and I just thought this was cute. I've got a thing for cats. As you can see, this kitten is hiding under a hat and being inconspicuous, probably to attack another kitten if they happen to walk by and don't see them. The greatest benefit of naturalistic observation is the validity or the accuracy of information collected unobtrusively in a natural setting. Having individuals behave as they normally would in a given situation means that we have a higher degree of ecological validity or realism than we might achieve with other research approaches. Therefore, our ability to generalize the findings of the research to real-world situation is enhanced. And of course, there's a deer right here. Very, looks like a deer's head, actually, but it's not, of course. It's a whole deer. It's just camouflaged. A potential problem in observational research is observer bias. Generally, people who act as observers are closely involved in the research project, and may unconsciously skew their observations to fit their research goals or expectations. To combat this, researchers often compare observations of the same event by multiple observers in order to test inter-rater reliability, a measure of reliability that assesses the consistency of observations by different observers. And this is inter-rater reliability to see if everybody gets the same result. Often psychologists develop surveys as a means of gathering data. Surveys are lists of questions to be answered by research participants and can be delivered as paper and pencil questionnaires, administered electronically, or conducted verbally. Generally, the survey itself can be completed in a short time, and the ease of administering a survey makes it easy to collect data from a large number of people. Surveys allow researchers to gather data from larger samples than may be afforded by other research methods. A sample is a subset of individuals selected from a population, which is the overall group of individuals that the researchers are interested in. Researchers study the sample and seek to generalize their findings to the population. And here's the population, all the people in the area, and here is the sample. So they've taken select ones and they have made them into their sample. Now, if they've done this properly, they've used a random sample. In other words, anybody in this group could be chosen to be their sample. And that is known as random sampling. If they pick and choose it's like playing basketball. If you pick all the tall guys to be on your team, then that's cheating, and you're going to beat the little short guys probably, because the little short guys won't get any rebounds. Researchers will begin this process by calculating various measures of central tendency from the data they have collected. These measures provide an overall summary of what a typical response looks like. There are 3 measures of central tendency: mode, median, and mean. The mode is the most frequently occurring response. So in this case, we have 2, 4, 5, 5, 4, 5. There are 3 5s, and that is your mode, 5. The median lies in the middle of the given data. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So the 5th one is your median, and in this case, it is a 9. So if you rank them in arithmetic order, you have 1, 2, 5, 7, 9, 9, 9, 11, 3, 13. 9 is also your mode, because there are more 9s in this than anything else. The mean is the arithmetic average of all data, and all you do is add them all up and divide by the number of numbers. So in this case, we have 7, 9, 5, and 3. If we add all those together, we get 24. Since there are 4 numbers, the average of 24 is 6. So 6 would be your mean. There are both strengths and weaknesses of the survey in comparison to case studies. By using surveys, we can collect information from a larger sample of people. A larger sample is better able to reflect the actual diversity of the population, thus allowing better generalizability. Therefore, if our sample is sufficiently large and diverse, we can assume that the data we collect from the survey can be generalized to the larger population with more certainty than the information collected through a case study. However, given the greater number of people involved, we are not able to collect the same depth of information on each person that would be collected in a case study. Another potential weakness of surveys is that people don't always give accurate responses. They may lie, misremember, or answer questions in a way that they think makes them look good. For example, people may report drinking less alcohol than is actually the case. And if you've ever worked in the emergency room, which I hope you never have, but if you've ever worked in the emergency room, you get a drunk that comes in, you ask him how much he drank, he will always say, "I only had a couple." Usually it's a couple of beers, sometimes it's a couple of shots, but he's drunk out of his gourd, of course, and you've got to do something with him, and you can't get him to tell you how many beers he had. When I was working in the Air Force, first time we ever did a intervention, there was this kid that was 21 years old, 21 years old, and he literally bought himself a case of beer every day. And by the next morning, he was fairly non-functional as a military member. And rather than just kick him out, they decided that they would try to fix him. So we had to dry him out. But he came in. When he first came in, we asked him, "Well, how much do you drink?" And he said, "I only drink a couple of beers at night. I'm not an alcoholic." You know, it was one of those kind of deals. Eventually, we got him to admit, "Yeah, I have a six-pack or so a night." Turned out he was drinking a whole case of beer every night. But, you know, alcoholics, people, they're always in denial. Anyway, he was certainly in denial. He had a girlfriend that used to drink as much as she tried to keep up with him. They drank different beers. Turned out his beer was weaker than her beer. And he was drinking a lot more of it than she was, but they were both drunk. Anyway, not important. Some researchers gain access to large amounts of data without interacting with a single research participant. One of the things you're going to do, if you take more classes from me, one of the things you're going to find out is that I don't really have a whole lot of patience with this kind of thing. I worked with this for all the years I was in the military. I worked with this when I worked in the emergency room. I was in medicine for 30 years. So, you don't really have a whole lot of patience for these kinds of things. And I apologize. Well, I don't apologize for that. I've been dealing with this in my professional life almost all my life. So, some researchers gain access to large amounts of data without interacting with a single research participant. Instead, they use existing records to answer various research questions. This type of research approach is known as archival research. Archival research relies on looking at past records or data sets to look for interesting patterns or relationships. The researcher employing archival research never directly interacts with research participants. Therefore, the investment of time and money to collect data is considerably less with archival research. Additionally, researchers have no control over what information was originally collected. Therefore, research questions have to be tailored so that they can be answered within the structure of the existing data sets. There is also no guarantee of consistency between the records from one source to another, which might make comparing and contrasting different data sets problematic. When we test the same group of individuals repeatedly over an extended period of time, we are conducting longitudinal research. Longitudinal research is a research design in which data gathering is administered repeatedly over an extended period of time. There has been an ongoing research. There was ongoing research into genius in California. It started in 1917, and it's going on till this day. I think all those people are dead, so it has stopped. The original researcher died in the 1940s, and then somebody else took over, and then he died, and then somebody else took over. There's another longitudinal research being done in Maui in Hawaii, looking at the resilience of people. And that one's been going on since the 1950s. And that one's still going on, of course. When I did my research, I used an instrument that was used by one of the researchers. And I had to write to her and ask her if it was okay for me to use her instrument. And she wrote a nice letter back and said, yes, as long as you send me your research. In cross-sectional research, a researcher compares multiple segments of the population at the same time. The researcher directly compares different age groups of people by age instead of studying a group of people for 20 years. The researcher would compare 20-year-old individuals with a group of 30-year-old individuals and a group of 40-year-old individuals. This is what I did. I did a cross-sectional research. I couldn't wait for 30 years to find out if these individuals had resilience. I wanted to find out right now, so I did a cross-sectional study of individuals from 18 to 80, actually. Statistics show that when people buy ice cream, more crimes are likely to occur. When ice cream sales rise, crime rates rise. So does buying ice cream cause crime? There's little correlation between the two. Crime increases when it is hot, as does ice cream sales. This is kind of funny because this guy stole an ice cream truck. So it isn't the fact that everybody's trying to steal ice cream that causes crime to go up when ice cream sales go up. It is because there are other factors. I'm sorry, I went the wrong direction. Correlation means that there is a relationship between two or more variables, but this relationship does not necessarily imply cause and effect. When two variables are correlated, it simply means that as one variable changes, so does the other. We can measure correlation by calculating a statistic known as a correlational coefficient. This is important. A correlational coefficient is a number from -1 to +1 that indicates the strength and direction of a relationship between variables. So what's right in the middle of -1 and +1? 0 is right in the middle. The correlation coefficient is usually represented by the letter R. The number portion of the correlation coefficient indicates the strength of the relationship. The closer the number is to 1, be it negative or positive, the more strongly related the variables are, and the more predictable changes in one variable will be as the other variable changes. So if it is close to -1, it's strong. If it's close to +1, it's strong. The closer the number is to 0, the weaker the relationship, and the less predictable the relationships between the variables becomes. For instance, a correlation coefficient of 0.9 indicates a far stronger relationship than a correlation coefficient of 0.3. If the variables are not related to one another at all, the correlation coefficient is 0. And that's theoretically what the ice cream sales and crime statistics, they have nothing to do with one another. So if we correlated the two, we'd discover a 0 correlation. The sign positive or negative of the correlation coefficient indicates the direction of the relationship. The positive correlation means the variables move in the same direction. Put another way, it means that as one variable increases, so does the other. And conversely, when one variable decreases, so does the other. A negative correlation means that the variables move in opposite directions. If two variables are negatively correlated, a decrease in one variable is associated with an increase in the other, and vice versa. So this is a negative correlation. This is a scatter plot, and if we write a line, then it's in a negative direction. This is a positive correlation. These two variables have something to do with one another. This is no correlation at all. Correlations can have predictive value. There is a positive correlation between an individual's height and their weight. The taller you are, the heavier you are. And this is the correlation between height and weight. A negative correlation exists between someone's tiredness during the day and the number of hours they slept the previous night. The amount of sleep decreases as the feelings of tiredness increase. And this is a negative correlation. As you can see, the fewer hours you slept, the more tired you feel. So one goes up as the other goes down. If we find no correlation between hours of sleep and shoe size, we find no correlation. Hours of sleep have nothing to do with shoe size. I wear a size 12.5, and I'm only 5'6". So, well, does height have something to do with shoe size? And the answer is, yeah, most tall people have big feet, but I'm an anomaly. I don't fit anywhere. I'm an anomaly. My wife thinks I'm an alien creature. I look like a hobbit. My feet are huge. Correlation is limited because establishing the existence of a relationship tells us little about cause and effect. While variables are sometimes correlated because one does cause the other, it could also be that some other factor, a confounding variable, is actually causing this systematic movement in our variables of interest. In the ice cream crime rate example mentioned earlier, temperature is a confounding variable that could account for the relationship between the two variables. Another word for confounding variable is intervening variable, something that has an effect that you're not looking at. When I did my resilience research, I was looking at 5 factors. Let me see if I can remember them. I was measuring resilience. I had an instrument that measured resilience. I was looking at age, gender, cultural degree, the amount of trauma that they had, and the amount of education. Okay, so there's 5 things. So of those 5 things, I found 3 that didn't have anything to do with resilience. Age didn't have anything to do with resilience. Education didn't have anything to do with resilience. And gender didn't have anything to do with resilience. There were 2 significant factors. One was a positive significance, and the other was the fact that it didn't have anything to do with resilience. And that was trauma. That was a surprise. Usually, the more trauma somebody has had, the less resilient they are. But in the population that I was measuring, it didn't have anything to do with that. Now, this is really kind of interesting because I was dealing with American Indians, and there had been 2 other pieces of research that showed that trauma did not affect resilience on Indian reservations. One was on the Navajo reservation, and the other was on the Hopi reservation. and they discovered that exactly the same thing that I did, that trauma had nothing to do with resilience. Whereas if we look at the white population, the black population, the Asian population, we look at Germans, we look at South Africans, we find that the more trauma they have had, the less resilient they are. Not so on Indian reservations. The one thing that had a positive correlation to resilience was the amount of culture that they adhered to. And I had a measurement that measured resilience, and I had one that measured the level of culture. And that's what I discovered. The temptation to make erroneous cause and effect statements based on correlational research is not the only way that we tend to misinterpret data. We also tend to make the mistake of illusory correlations, especially with unsystematic observations. Illusory correlations or false correlations occur when people believe that relationships exist between two things when no such relationship exists. One of them would be creaky joints and a rainy day. You probably have creaky joints every day. You just think about it more during a rainy day. Why are we so apt to believe in illusory correlations like this? Often we read or hear about them and simply accept the information as valid. Or we have a hunch about how something works and then look for evidence to support that hunch, ignoring evidence that would tell us our hunch is false. This is known as confirmation bias. Other times we find illusory correlations based on the information that comes most easily to mind, even if that information is severely limited. Unfortunately, it's easier to believe comforting lies than it is to believe unpleasant truths. And one of them, of course, is global warming. We can't get select conservative people to believe that global warming exists. In the scientific context, an experiment has precise requirements for design and implementation. In order to conduct an experiment, a researcher must have a specific hypothesis to be tested. And hypotheses can be formulated either through direct observation of the real world or after careful review of previous research. Personal observations are what often lead us to formulate a specific hypothesis, but we cannot use limited personal observations and anecdotal evidence to rigorously test our hypothesis. Instead, to find out if real-world data supports our hypothesis, we have to conduct an experiment. So anecdotal evidence is not used in science. The most basic experimental design involves two groups, the experimental group and the control group. The two groups are designed to be the same except for one difference, the experimental manipulation. The experimental group gets the experimental manipulation, that is the treatment or variable being tested, and the control group does not. Since experimental manipulation is the only difference between the experimental and control groups, we can be sure that any differences between the two are due to experimental manipulation rather than chance. And of course, this is how they tested the vaccine. Some people got the vaccine and some people got a placebo, something that did not affect them. And they tried to determine if the vaccine actually kept people from getting COVID. Not that they were trying to get people infected with COVID, but they were looking at percentages to see if the people that they tested the vaccine on didn't get it more readily than people that were getting that got the placebo. We also need to precisely define or operationalize how we measure our variable. An operational definition is a precise description of our variables, and it is important in allowing others to understand exactly how and what a researcher measures in a particular experiment. This aids people's ability to interpret our data, as well as their capacity to repeat our experiment should they choose to do so. And of course, this is an experiment looking at sandwiches. A sandwich is the total number of items with something delicious between two slices of bread. Lobsters are delicious. This lobster is between two slices of bread. Does that make it a sandwich? These are three standard sandwiches, and is that a sandwich is the question. So you need specific operational definitions would you eat a lobster inside two pieces of bread? And the answer is not if the shells were still on. I can't eat lobster anyway. So ideally, the people who score the test are unaware of who was assigned to the experimental or control group in order to control for experimenter bias. Experimenter bias refers to the possibility that a researcher's expectations might skew the results of the study. If the observers know who is in which group, it might influence how they interpret ambiguous results. By being blind to who is in which group, the researcher is protected against those biases. This situation is a single blind study, meaning that one of the group's participants are unaware as to which group they are in, experiment or control group, while the researcher who developed the experiment knows which participants are in each group. In a double-blind study, both the researchers and the participants are blind to group assignments. By doing so, we can control for both experimenter and participant expectations. The placebo effect occurs when people's expectations or beliefs influence or determine their experience in a given situation. In other words, simply expecting something to happen can actually make it happen. And this is known as the placebo effect. Sorry, I had to close the door since the dogs are starting to bark. I've got 3 of them. They all come from your reservation, by the way. They're wonderful dogs. I'm glad I have them, and they are all strays that I picked up on your reservation. In research experiment, we strive to study whether changes in one thing cause changes in another. To achieve this, we must pay attention to 2 different variables or things that can be changed in any experimental study: the independent variable and the dependent variable. An independent variable is manipulated or controlled by the experimenter. In a well-designed experimental study, the independent variable is the only important difference between the experimental and control groups. A dependent variable is what the researcher measures to see how much effect the independent variable has. In my research, the dependent variable was resilience, and the independent variables were age, education, gender, trauma, and level of culture. Those were my independent variables. Now, I didn't manipulate them. It was a kind of a different experiment. It was a survey experiment. So I didn't manipulate anything. All I did was measure all 6 of these things. Resilience, they told me their age, they told me their gender, they told me their level of education. I had an instrument that measured their level of trauma. And I had an instrument that measured their level of culture. Now that our study is designed, we need to obtain a sample of individuals to include in the experiment. We need to determine who to include. Participants are the subjects of psychological research. Individuals who are involved in psychological research actively participate in the process. Often, psychological research projects rely on college students to serve as participants. The vast majority of research in psychology subfields has historically involved students as research participants. But are college students truly representative of general population? So why in the world are college students used? Because most research psychologists work at colleges or universities. And so they do experiments on their students. It's easier, it's cheaper. They can give them grades instead of paying them money. But are college students truly representative of the general population? College students tend to be younger, more educated, more liberal, and less diverse than the general population. Although using students as test subjects is an accepted practice, relying on such a limited pool of research participants can be problematic because it is difficult to generalize findings to the larger population. I could have done that. I could have just done research on the student population at the college I was working at, but I wanted to do a cross-sectional study of everybody on the reservation. It didn't work out that way. I only had 135 participants. But there was a cross section. I had people that were 18. I had people that were in their 80s. I had elders. I had youth. It was interesting. If possible, a random sample should be used. A random sample is a subset of a larger population in which every member of the population has an equal chance of being selected. Random samples are preferred because if the sample is large enough, we can be reasonably sure that the participating individuals are representative of the larger population. This means that the percentages of characteristics in the sample, sex, ethnicity, socioeconomic level, and any other characteristics that might affect the results are close to those percentages in the larger population. The next step of experimental process is to split the participants into experimental and control groups through random assignment. With random assignment, all participants have an equal chance of being assigned to either group. Random assignment is critical for sound experimental design. With sufficiently large samples, random assignment makes it unlikely that there are differences between the groups. It would be very unlikely that we would get one group composed entirely of males or a given religious ideology. This is important because if the groups were systematically different before the experiment began, we would not know the origin of any differences we find between the groups. Were the differences pre-existing or were they caused by a manipulation of the independent variable? Random assignment allows us to assume that any differences observed between experimental and control groups result from the manipulation of the independent variable. True experiments require the experimenter to manipulate an independent variable, and that can complicate many questions the psychologists might want to address. We categorize this type of research approach as quasi-experimental and recognize that we cannot make cause and effect claims in these circumstances. Experimenters are also limited by ethical constraints. Mine was a quasi-experimental experiment. It was not a true experiment. Once data is collected from both the experimental and the control groups, a statistical analysis is conducted to find out if there are meaningful differences between the two groups. A statistical analysis determines how likely any difference found is due to chance and thus not meaningful. Generally, psychologists consider differences to be statistically significant if there is less than 5% chance of observing them if the groups did not actually differ from one another. Stated in another way, psychologists want to limit the chances of making false positive claims to 5% or less. This is the possibility of outliers being true. And this is the 95% of what I got. The greatest strength of experiments is the ability to assert that any significant differences in the findings are caused by the independent variable. This occurs because random selection, random assignment, and a design that limits the effects of both experimenter bias and participant expectancy should create groups that are similar in composition and treatment. Therefore, any difference between the groups is attributable to the independent variable, and now we can finally make a causal statement. When psychologists complete a research project, they generally want to share their findings with other scientists. The American Psychological Association, the APA, publishes a manual detailing how to write a paper for submission to scientific journals. We are in the 7th edition. It is orange and blue. So if you see a one that is solid blue, that's 6. That's not the one we're working with. We're working on the 7th edition. So if you're looking at an APA manual, make sure it's the 7th edition. Scientific journals generally publish peer-reviewed journal articles aimed at an audience of professionals and scholars who are actively involved in research themselves. Peer review provides some degree of quality control for psychological research. Poorly conceived or executed studies can be weeded out, and even well-designed research can be improved by the revisions suggested. Peer review also ensures that the research is described clearly enough to allow other scientists to replicate it, meaning they can repeat the experiment using different samples to determine reliability. Reliability and validity are two important considerations that must be made with any type of data collection. Reliability refers to the ability to consistently produce a given result. In the context of psychological research, this would mean that any instruments or tools used to collect data do so in consistent, reproducible ways. There are a number of different types of reliability. There's inter-rater reliability, the degree to which two or more different observers agree on what has been observed. There's internal consistency, the degree to which different items on a survey that measure the same thing correlate with one another. There is retest reliability, the degree to which the outcomes of a particular measure remain consistent over multiple administrations. Unfortunately, being consistent in the measurement does not necessarily mean that they have measured something correctly. This is where validity comes into play. Validity refers to the extent to which a given instrument or tool accurately measures what it's supposed to measure, and there are a number of ways in which validity can be expressed. Ecological validity, the degree to which research results generalize to real-world applications. Construct validity, the degree to which a given variable actually captures or measures what it is intended to measure. And face validity, the degree to which a given variable seems valid on the surface. While any valid measure is reliable, the reverse is not necessarily true. Today, scientists agree that good research is ethical in nature and is guided by a basic respect for human dignity and safety. Modern researchers must demonstrate that the research they perform is ethically sound. Any experiment involving the participation of human subjects is governed by extensive, strict guidelines designed to ensure that the experiment does not result in harm. Any research institution that receives federal support for research involving human participants must have access to an institutional review board, or IRB. The IRB is a committee of individuals often made up of members of the institution's administration, scientists, and community members. The purpose of the IRB is to review proposals for research that involves human participants. The IRB reviews these proposals with the principles mentioned above in mind, and generally approval from the IRB is required in order for the experiment to proceed. An institution's IRB requires several components in any experiment it approves. Each participant must sign an informed consent form before they can participate in the experiment. An informed consent form provides a written description of what participants can expect during the experiment, including potential risks and implications of the research. It also lets participants know that their involvement is completely voluntary and can be discontinued without penalty at any time. The informed consent guarantees that any data collected in the experiment will remain completely confidential. In cases where research participants are under the age of 18, the parents or legal guardians are required to sign the informed consent form. While the informed consent form should be as honest as possible in describing exactly what participants will be doing, sometimes deception is necessary to prevent participants' knowledge of the exact research question from affecting the results of the study, like in the Milgram experiment. They didn't want them to know that they were studying obedience, so they told them they were studying educational research. Deception involves purposely misleading experiment participants in order to maintain the integrity of the experiment, but not to the point where the deception could be considered harmful. Using deception in an experiment is frowned upon now, so lying to your participants is usually rejected. Many psychologists conduct research involving animal subjects. Often these researchers use rodents or birds as the subjects of their experiments. The APA estimates that 90% of all animals research in psychology uses birds and rodents, mice and rats mostly. The humane and ethical treatment of animal research subjects is a critical aspect of this type of research. Researchers must design their experiments to minimize any pain or distress experienced by animals serving as research subjects. Whereas IRBs review research proposals that involve human participants, animal experimental proposals are reviewed by an institutional animal care and use committee. This is usually includes a veterinarian. And that is it. So let me turn this thing off. I have to go anyway. There you go.